Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Eduardo Moncada, Assistant Professor of Political Science at Barnard College, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this webinar on police violence in comparative perspective. This event is sponsored by the Institute of Latin American Studies and the Center for the Study of Ethnicity and Race, both at Columbia University. I want to thank quickly Vicky Murillo, who's a professor in the Department of Political Science and School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia, and also the director of the Institute, and also Esteban Andrade and all the staff at the Institute for making today's event possible. So we are very fortunate to have 4 leading scholars joining us today to share their insights. And part of the impetus behind today's event is the reality that in recent years, police violence across both Latin America and the United States has sparked political mobilization, protest, debate, and dialogue. And that while this phenomenon has many different dimensions, one of the core concerns across these settings is the racialized character of policing. The specific nature of this policing varies, ranging from the disproportionate and heavy-handed policing of communities of color, to the everyday tactics of stop and frisk, to the use of violent technologies and tactics more commonly seen in wartime settings. And these actions have important political consequences for citizenship, political participation, institutional legitimacy, democracy, as well as social and economic development. So today we've brought together a fantastic group of scholars to help us think through some generative points of engagement and discussion and debate on these important and pressing issues to move forward the research agenda. I'm going to first briefly introduce each of the speakers, and then they will each have about 12 minutes to present, and then we'll open up the conversation to the audience. For those watching the webinar on the call or via Facebook who would like to submit questions to the presenters, please use the question and answer option in Zoom, and we will relay those questions to the presenters. So let me introduce our speakers in the order in which they are presenting. Lucía Demer is a professor of international relations at the Universidad de Santiago de Chile. She's widely known as an expert in public security, crime, and criminal justice reform in Latin America. Among her books are Fear of Crime in Latin America and an excellent edited volume entitled Maras, Gang Violence and Security in Central America. She's also held key advisory positions in Chile, Argentina, Mexico, and Peru, and she has also served as a key advisor at the Organization of American States and other regional policymaking and development organizations. Gustavo Flores Macias is Associate Professor of Government and Associate Vice Provost for International Affairs at Cornell University. His research focuses broadly on political and economic development, including the politics of economic reform, taxation, and state capacity. His work has appeared or is forthcoming in many of the top journals in political science. He's the author of the book After Neoliberalism, The Left and Economic Reform in Latin America, which won the Latin American Studies Association Tomasini Award. And most recently, he's the editor of a wonderful edited volume, The Political Economy of Taxation in Latin America, published by Cambridge University Press. Yanilda Maria Gonzalez is an assistant professor of public policy at the Harvard Kennedy School. Her research focuses on policing, state violence, and citizenship and democracy, examining how race, class, and other forms of inequality shape these processes. She just published an amazing new book titled Authoritarian Police and Democracy, Contested Security in Latin America with Cambridge University Press. And in this book, she studies the persistence of police forces as authoritarian enclaves in otherwise democratic states, demonstrating how ordinary democratic politics in unequal societies can both reproduce authoritarian policing and bring about rare moments of reform. And Vessel May Weaver is the Bloomberg Distinguished Associate Professor of Political Science and Sociology at Johns Hopkins University and a 2016-17 Andrew Carnegie Fellow. Her research focuses on the persistence of racial inequality, colorism in the United States, the causes and consequences of dramatic rise in prisons, and the consequences of rising economic polarization. In addition to publishing articles in the discipline's top journals, she's also the co-author with Amy Lerman of a powerful book, Arresting Citizenship, The Democratic Consequences of American Crime Control, which was published by the University of Chicago Press and which also won the Dennis Judd Best Book Award from the Urban and Local Politics section of the American Political Science Association. So I want to welcome and thank each of you for taking the time to be here today from all corners of the world for this conversation. And with that said, Lucia, would you like to get us started? I think you have to, there you go.
Yeah. Thank you, Eduardo. After so many Zooms, I wouldn't forget to put my mic on. So thank you for inviting me to this excellent conversation with this superb group of people that I know for so many years. I'm really glad that we are finally talking about the police in Latin America, because for many years the police was absent in the really debate on public policy and even in democratic terms in Latin America. So my presentation, I just have 10 minutes. So I will focus on Chile, because I think this is a very interesting case in which, you know, police legitimacy and the use of violence by the police basically represents what the political realm wants them to represent. So instead of just focusing on race, I'm focusing on the intersectionality of police violence in Latin America in general, and specifically in the case of Chile. After so many years of democratization, we still have political policing in Latin America. Of course, that's very evident in the cases of Nicaragua, more recently, Venezuela, and of course, Cuba. But also in the last decade, we have seen the use of the police and policing strategies very much linked to political use in cases such as the Bolivia process just recently, in Peru and Honduras and Ecuador and others. So the point that I'm trying to make is that in fact, policing is still a political tool. And is growing, the growing presence of police forces in the political debate is very much related with the capabilities that they have, and they can of course suppress conflict. They are helping to marginalize those considered different in terms of race, in terms of socioeconomic development, in terms of um, um, youth, also for the youth. They label actions as criminals in order to limit their voices. And that's the whole process of social manifestations on the streets. In many cases in Latin America, you know, instead of really fighting the social roots of the protestation, of the contestation on the streets, what we're doing is they are making them, we're calling them criminals, and then the police is the tool for them for us to use as governments. Also, we have been able in the last 3 or 4 decades to concentrate on some specific crimes, such as theft, burglary, you know, even homicides, leaving other type of crimes very open, such as white collar crimes, but also corruption. So there is an intertwined relationship between the lack of efficiency or effectiveness of the police in certain areas and the interest of the elite in many countries. Also, in some countries, I'm doing research now in Peru, of course, political interest in police investigating political opposition, delivering key information, intelligence, and bringing also some forces into the urban margins. And well, there is a lot of documents and research on the urban margins in Latin America, from Augero and so on and so forth. So in general, in Latin America, and specifically in Chile, police has been used to control the poor. Although there is a technocratic rhetoric about police reform, and I work on that a lot, increasing levels of accountability or even developing police indicators. In fact, police violence and impunity is still high almost everywhere, and Chile is not an exception. Most notably, in the urban margins, we have increasing levels of police violence against youth, against the poor, and against male. Those are the three specific areas. Of course, in this intersectionality, race plays an important role, and I will go back to that in a few minutes. So while the political elites allow the police to act, these levels of autonomy have increased and transparency have been limited in the last perhaps 15 years. So the police is the tool of the politicians to actually control all type of conflict, but in that process, the police has grew stronger, and they have more autonomy, they have more political power, they have more budgets, they have more people. So my sense is that now, after 3 decades of democratization in Latin America and in Chile specifically, the police is more powerful than before. And that's really a paradox in the whole process. So in the case of Chile, just I want to mention 3 or 4 specific characteristics. Chile still is the safest country in Latin America. We have a homicide rate around 4. Some sources, mentioned 5, but it's still really, really low. However, we have high levels of trust. Also, we have high levels of trust in the police, although we have some scandals in the last 5 or 6 years. But in general, and specifically those in the high socioeconomic sectors, they really trust the police a lot. These situation of low levels of homicides are really not connected in some areas with high levels of fear of crime. That includes, bringing crime as the most important issue in all previous elections. And this year that we have 2021, that we have 4 elections, everything is going to change here in Chile. Of course, crime is becoming again a hot topic, and then the police and their power is also a topic to be discussed. However, in the last since 1990, there is almost no difference between public policies being implemented from the center left or the center right. So we have basically the same policies that actually concentrate power on police. And when I'm talking about the police, I'm mostly talking about Carabineros de Chile, which is the military type of police here in Chile. The political neglect of public security policies could be understand or could be characterized in terms of high levels of police autonomy, high increasing budgets, and limited civil control. In fact, some people nowadays are discussing, why do we need civil control over the police since they are so, professional and efficient? So that's the type of situations that we are facing now. I'm just gonna briefly highlight some policies that I think basically describe what we are doing here in Chile in terms of police power or police violence. First of all, we have an increasing numbers of police and frisk or police and search processes. We have amplified the possibilities of the police to request you for your document and your identification. And those stop and search went from almost 2 million in 2014 to almost 6 million police and search situations in 2019. So almost every youth in poor neighborhoods have been in contact with the police in a very unequal, highly violent, probably, situation in the last 12 months. And that's something that we should discuss. This power that we have given to the police, I think is just, allowing them to targeting the poor, to targeting specific groups with more and more violence. Also, we have the second policy that I think is very important to discuss is Estadio Seguro, secure stadium. And this is a policy that was implemented to fight insecurity in soccer games, that allows for increasing presence of the police, that allows for a lot of violence against soccer fans, that allows for increasing movement, a continuous movement of violence from within the stadiums into the neighborhoods around the stadiums. But mostly that allows for many youth who were soccer fans to be placed outside their area of specific interest. Then the second policy is what we call aula segura. As you know, we always call segura to everything. That's a policy. That's a school safety or safe school. And that policy allow school principals basically to expel students who were supposed to be violent, and to include police officers, as you can see in the pictures, within high school schools. So that also brought a lot of contestation between amongst the youth, specifically the youth, of course, from poor neighborhoods. Um, and when we last 2019, when we asked why are so many people on the streets, where those kids were used to fight the police for a long time. Then we have the what we call the Mapuche problem. Of course, you know the Mapuche is the Aboriginal group here in Chile, the largest Aboriginal group, and we have a process of policialization of the Mapuche problem. There is, of course, a labeling of them as terrorists. There is a continuous process of escalation of violence. And this political problem is being treated as a criminal one. So the easy answer for politicians in this case, in which, of course, society is highly um, uh, classist and is highly racist in some cases towards Aboriginal groups, the easy answer is to use the police. So I briefly mentioned before, we had this good police that had a lot of trust from society and from citizens. But in the last 5 years, we have lots of scandals going from corruption all the way into excessive use of force. Of course, the killing of Camilo Catrillanca, which is a young Mapuche leader who was actually doing his business, and he was actually murdered by the police. But the police tried to explain that the situation was a confrontation between Camilo Catrillanca and the police. And actually, some of the police officers lied to the minister. That brought the idea that, we have been lied by the police a lot, and the Mapuche people are really facing lots of violence from the police. And then we got, I think those are the elements that were there, in the pressure cooker for a long time in Chile, that actually sparkle, during the social upheaval of 2019. We have more than 5,000 reports of human rights violations by Carabineros de Chile. We saw the excessive use of force. There is an increasing level of discussion on the legitimacy of violence of the police on the streets. And of course, there is a general sense of discrimination and anger against the police, who has been on schools, on soccer fields, on the urban margins, and against, specifically against the Mapuche community, very violent and of course impune. So there is an impunity situation over here. And all these elements allow, after 20 years of working on police reform, I think that we really need to move the topic a little bit. Instead of just talking about, the technocratic issues of police reform and better training and human rights classes and all that thing, we really need to realize that police brutality requires a profound social change, and that the police reform is actually a political reform. So instead of just focusing on the police and how can we actually, change it and mold it into a different institution, we really, from the Chilean perspective and into the whole Latin American comparative analysis, we really have to make a step back and look at how societies are really racist, are really classist, are really, authoritarian in some ways, and we have been using the police as a tool to maintain everything as the way the elite, the political, even the center left political elite, and of course the economic elite wants. So in my sense is that we need to open this space for a better understanding of police reform, and in that sense to include the police brutality agenda into the social change, into the discussion of the change of the neoliberal model here in Latin America. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucia. Thank you for reminding us that policing is an inherently political phenomenon and that we should be approaching it that way. Gustavo, you're next.
Thank you. And I'd like to start by thanking Eduardo, Vicky, Esteban, everybody at ILAS who made this possible. It is a real honor for me to share the floor with Professors Barnard, Gonzalez, Weaver, Moncada, scholars whose work has been quite influential for my own research. And I also see familiar faces in the participant list in the audience, and many whose work I've also relied on quite a bit for this. So it's great to see everyone. I will share my screen if that's okay. And what I'll do is I'll share a PowerPoint presentation. After Lucia's PowerPoint, I very much have PowerPoint envy right now. But hopefully this will provide a sense of what I have for you today is a little bit of what I've been doing in collaboration with Jessica Sarkin, who's a Mexican PhD student at Cornell, and with an eye toward a research agenda on race and policing in the Latin American context, which is the one that I know best. Most of this research agenda at its core focuses on this simple question, right? Where there are these two pictures here. We see that the one on the left has police, the one on the right has military armed forces. And the main question is whether this difference actually matters for law enforcement purposes. And what I'd like to do today is walk you through a little bit of what we've done in this regard, situating this research in the context of tough on crime approaches, right, mano dura in the context of Latin America, punitive populism, and a little bit of what we've done in terms of mapping the extent to which militarization has taken place, some conceptual development, theoretical development in this regard, and some empirical work having to do with the consequences for levels of violence, for human rights violations, and perceptions of the military and the police. And then I'll move on to explaining some potential paths for the connection between policing and race and ethnicity in the region. And hopefully this is something that might spark some ideas as to what can be done in the future. I'll say a word about some of the main challenges that at least we've encountered, and I'll close with what I see as some of the main stakes for Latin America with this type of research and this problem. So let me begin by situating this in the context of this tough on crime literature and approaches. The tough on crime approaches are not new to Latin America, and they have been around for quite some time. But perhaps in recent years, there has been an escalation of many of these. And in part, that has been an example from the US and other developed countries. Here I have just some ways in which we can identify, or some examples of this tough on crime approach, the militarization of law enforcement itself, but also tougher sentences, so-called three-strike laws, reduced civil liberties. Lucia was alluding to this as well, this constraint of the rights of people that are suspected criminals, and also policies that just contribute toward mass incarceration. So my agenda touches briefly on these issues, but really the one that it focuses on squarely is the militarization of law enforcement. And when I say the militarization of law enforcement, I mean militarization broadly. I mean both police that become more like military, but also militaries that become constabularized, or that they are assigned to policing missions, let's say. And one of the main challenges of this problem, at least in Latin America, is how popular these tough on crime approaches have been. This is just one dimension of the problem, but this graph shows the support for constabularization in Latin America. And you can see that even in places like Chile and Uruguay, where the police are actually, fairly respected, even in those places, you have a majority of respondents expressing that they support the military becoming involved in addressing crime and violence. And then, of course, in countries like El Salvador, Honduras, the Dominican Republic, these percentages are extremely high. So it's a fairly popular policy. The research I'm involved in looks into some of the causes of constabularization and some of its consequences as well. I won't go into details here because of time, but I will focus more on the consequences for our purposes here. And one of the first things we did was trying to systematize the mapping of the extent to which this phenomenon is taking place. So we know that, there are many country reports that the phenomenon has been taking place. It's very difficult to keep track of the extent to which this is happening because there are many different forms of militarization. Again, police becoming more like military, some hybrid forms of, gendarmerie style or civil guard type of constabularization as well, or militarization, and then the armed forces themselves becoming involved. This just gives you a sense of some of the intensity differences in the region that have to do with the intensity. And we also try to develop theoretically what each of these different types of militarization might mean. First of all, identifying them. I'm showing here some pictures. Obviously, there are important differences across countries and across the world, but just, it's not the same when you have a community type of policing, when you have police that are militarized and might be wearing tactical gear, that maybe they have certain type of training, and then having actual military with a military formation coming in to conduct law enforcement. So we started drawing out some of the implications on different dimensions. And this is just to give you a taste. I won't go into details, but we can easily think about differences in the types of weapons, in the types of training, in the types of organizational structures, and even accountability structures that might lead to very different outcomes. And we can think of this as a continuum depending on the type of force that we're seeing, of security force. And we started drawing out these outcomes and thinking about the mechanisms through which the type of training, the type of organization might lead to things that we've identified as greater violence, more human rights violations, obstacles to police reform, perhaps disconnect between the legal framework and reality, leading to legal vacuums. And then we started looking into, trying to find empirical evidence for these theoretical claims or these hypotheses. And most of this work has focused, again, in Latin America, and in particular in the Mexican context, in part because that's where we found some of the data, the fine-grained data available. I'm showing here an example of a paper in which I look into the consequences of bringing in the military for policing and its consequences for violence. And I show here on the left homicides and on the right kidnapping rates. And you can see sort of the difference. You can think of a solid line, the gap between the solid line and the other lines as the difference that it made to bring in the military compared to what we should have observed in the absence of the military. The same is true for human rights. These two graphs just show the trends. They're just descriptive statistics of human rights complaints in the Mexican context against different security agencies. And the dotted line at the very bottom is complaints against the federal police. This dashed line here is complaints against the armed forces, for, say, the army. And then the solid line is a combination of all security forces. And we see gaps here. And, I'm just showing these descriptive statistics. In a paper, we go in depth into trying to disentangle, addressing concerns regarding inference and trying to disentangle really what's going on at the municipal level. One of the things that we see is that there doesn't seem to be much learning in terms of the military performing policing duties. Instead, when the military come in, this is a graph that just shows for municipalities in Mexico between 2006, 10 years later. You can see that there doesn't seem to be much learning here. It's not that this is compared to the civilian police, how the military is performing in terms of human rights violations, and it doesn't seem to be getting much better, contrary to some of the claims that we see floating around. The last sort of empirical piece that I'll show here is some research that I find extremely interesting, that is a survey experiment that shows people different images of law enforcement personnel. And we vary features of the images. Here you can see the one thing that varies in this one is just the uniform that the person in the image is wearing. But we also vary, whether it's a man or a woman, we also vary the skin color, and we vary the type of weapon. And we ask about perceptions when people face these images, perceptions of competence in law enforcement, perceptions of respect for human rights, civil liberties, corruption, and a number of dimensions. And what we find is that just seeing these images has important, it sort of moves people's perceptions or elicits certain perceptions. And the military, consistent with the graph that I showed in terms of the high support that there is, the military brings these perceptions of competence and respect for human rights and less corruption. In terms of race and ethnicity, one of the things that we vary is the skin color. Again, sort of looking into colorism here. And we find that a lighter skin color elicits perceptions of better protection in law enforcement and a higher respect for civil liberties. This is just a summary here that I have some of the results that I just described with some specifics in terms of the magnitude of these effects or these consequences. But just connecting these issues with an agenda looking into race and ethnicity. We know that these tough on crime approaches more generally beyond militarization really disproportionately affect communities of color and minorities. Here, the chart on the right in the context of Brazil shows, just in one state, in the state of Sao Paulo, the sort of dark bars here will show the percentage in each municipality, the percent of people who are Black or that at least identify as Black in the census. And then the tall orange bar will show the people that are incarcerated, the sort of Blacks who are incarcerated in the justice system in that municipality. And you see, a huge discrepancy there. And this is true on many levels across the country. Let me show. In the case of Colombia, we see, this is just a case of a recent, this was in the news recently, it's not recent, but the case of the false positives in which the military started executing civilians to make them seem like they were members of the guerrilla. And this way the military would get promotions and would get even compensation. A high incidence of these horrendous actions fall on communities of color in Colombia. And then the last example that I have here, and again, to give you a sense of the stakes, in Mexico, this famous massacre in Ayotzinapa in the state of Guerrero, with 43 students that were, disappeared. More and more information is surfacing. Again, most of them indigenous background. It is believed that the military and the police massacred these students. So just again, the stakes are so high. There are so many avenues for research that I would encourage those interested in the topic to pursue. Just very quickly, some of the challenges. Data are hard to come by in Latin America. There are also just so many different types of security forces that make this somewhat challenging. And when the military come in and maybe the police are assigned somewhere else, this is non-random assignment. So this brings quite a few challenges to inference. But I would argue that I mean, it can be difficult work, but really rewarding, and especially because the stakes are so high for the region. As we know, there's such a high correlation in the region between income and race and ethnicity. And these tough on crime approaches really, really lead to this criminalization of poverty and therefore of minorities, ethnic minorities. We know as these three examples that I showed in Brazil, in Colombia, and Mexico, that the stakes are especially high. And we're really talking about the level of massacres in Colombia. We're talking about thousands of people just in the false positives case. And the same in Mexico, we have, mass graves that are just, it's still to be discovered the extent of the problem. But this, of course, just leaves a huge deficit for the region in terms of the citizenship rights and the quality of democracy. So it's, I think, just a tremendous opportunity for anybody interested in this research. So I'll stop there. I want to thank everybody for your time, and again, Eduardo, for the invitation. I look forward to questions and comments.
Great. Thank you, Gustavo. That was wonderful. And I'm sure we already see questions in the Q&A. And just a reminder, if you have questions, to please submit them through the Q&A, and then we'll take them at the end among the panelists. So thank you, Gustavo. Yanilda. You may be muted.
Okay, sorry. I've been off Zoom for a couple of months, so I'm a little rusty. So as I figure out how to share my screen, I'll just begin by thanking, as Gustavo did, Eduardo and Vicky and Esteban for the invitation to be here, and similarly, just such a pleasure and a privilege to be able to share this virtual stage with Gustavo and Eduardo and Lucia and Veshla, as always. So let me, am I sharing?
See the whole, there you go, perfect.
Okay, and do you see just the thing, or do you see my notes also?
Just the slides.
Okay, perfect, thank you. As I said, rusty. So I wanted to present sort of some of the things that I'm thinking about these days as we're seeing the sort of ongoing contestation around the globe around issues of policing. So over the past year, we really have seen a global outcry over police violence, contestation over police powers and the role of police in society. And we've seen this from France and Belgium to Chile, Brazil, Colombia, Nigeria, with the NSARS movement, and of course, right here in the US. And so sort of with all of these movements, it has sort of raised some questions in light of my book as I sort of expand upon in this talk. And I'll just sort of stop at some point when I reach my time as I sort of develop some of these questions that I'm asking myself. So of course, we've seen in all these different spaces a resounding rejection of violent, predatory, unaccountable police forces and practices that are incompatible with democracy. But the kind of question that I'm asking myself now, as I'm seeing the kind of resurgence of sort of global protests around these issues, is whether democracies can adequately address this demand for meaningful change in how police exercise their power and the extent to which they are accountable to the citizenry. So I'm going to draw on part of the argument that an analysis from my book, which Eduardo kindly mentioned, and extend a couple of the cases that I examine in the book to more of the present day, and explore this question from one particular angle. So specifically, I'm going to think about why democracies are so often unable to rein in what I call authoritarian policing, and provide a brief overview of how democratic processes in the past did lead to ambitious structural reforms in some of the cases that I study that really sought to promote democratic policing. But I'll also provide, as I said, this extension to the present day to sort of draw a contrast to those past moments that I study. What we see today is the emergence or kind of a strengthening of what I call the reform gap in policing, and I work on this in other in another work. But essentially, that's a striking disparity between the substantive problems facing policing that drive large numbers of citizens to the streets in protest, um, and the types of reforms that are being proposed and enacted. So I'll pose questions about the implications of this reform gap for democracy and for policing, and hope that we can discuss this together. But really, the idea here is really centering democracy and what it makes possible and what it allows to happen and what it can't sort of stop, seemingly. And so this question about the persistence of police violence in democracy is a recurring one that emerged during my fieldwork, with many observers pointing out the continuity between police practices under authoritarian regimes carried over into a democratic period. I mean, it was summarized most compellingly by these two women activists who suffered it firsthand. So first, Deborah Silva, who lost her son to police violence in Sao Paulo, Brazil, she challenged former President Dilma Rousseff to question whether the dictatorship had really ended, given the large numbers of citizens killed by police in democracy. And similarly, Nora Cortiñas, one of the mothers of the famed mothers of Plaza de Mayo of Argentina, similarly told me that while the military and police went back to the barracks when the dictatorship ended, the police have had continuity, enjoying what she says is carte blanche to engage in violence. And this continuity of police violence and democracy is something that it's been an enduring puzzle among scholars of democracy in Latin America for decades. And as these scholars have wondered, in the words of Paul Chevigny, why democratic societies would tolerate such police systems. And so this is the question that's at the heart of my book, which looks at why democracies face such a challenge in reining in violent, unaccountable police forces, and under what conditions can democratic processes yield the conditions for police reform. So just very briefly, I define a continuum in the book between authoritarian coercion and democratic coercion. And what I show is that obviously it doesn't, the type of police doesn't correspond to the type of regime necessarily. And so, essentially I define, happy to talk about the sort of underlying literature for this, this classification, but essentially authoritarian police forces, which will seem familiar, to Veshla working in the US, to Lucia working in Chile, Gustavo in Mexico, Eduardo in, Colombia, El Salvador, and myself, and, all of you in the audience. Despite the fact that we have democratic regimes formally in these countries, we still see police behaving in these authoritarian ways. So deploying coercion in the interest of political leaders rather than citizens, engaging in use of force that is arbitrary or exceptional, and sort of, as I'll discuss when I talk about the cases, right, this arbitrary expression of force looks, almost always looks like unaccountable violence against citizens defined by race, class, and geography. So again, the use of force being arbitrary in that way rather than being defined by the rule of law. And finally, with external accountability mechanisms that are weak or non-existent, rather than what we'd expect in democracy, which would be robust. So the question of the book is sort of why do police persist as authoritarian institutional enclaves in democracy, and under what conditions do we see reform to undertake democratic coercion? And what I show in the book, and I'll sort of maybe skip ahead to this, is that in two of the cases that I studied, democracy does bring about these conditions to produce democratic coercion, defined in the ways that I've said, in the interest of citizens, based on the rule of law, and subjected to robust external accountability. So in the cases that I study in the book, we see that democratic processes under certain conditions do end up leading to reforms that really seek to be quite ambitious and transformative in thinking about policing. Specifically in the cases of Buenos Aires province, in the case of Colombia, when we see, and what I mean by democratic processes, when we see a kind of a convergence, sort of mass mobilization, and in the case of within civil society, but across diverse societal sectors, so going across cleavages of race, class, and geography, on the one hand, and on the other, when we see a robust political competition, these two factors are what end up leading politicians to enact reform, big, ambitious, expansive reforms to promote democratic coercion, as I'll show when I briefly discuss the Colombian case. And what I want to sort of, hopefully I'll get to the point in my talk, but to show us sort of that in the present day, we're sort of seeing a contraction in the willingness of political leaders and society to demand that kind and to enact that kind of big, expansive police reform, and that the space of the sort of policy space for police reform has narrowed greatly relative to the cases that I studied from a couple of decades ago. So I'll start with the case of the Colombian National Police, which is a great illustration of how democratic politics can both drive the persistence of authoritarian policing and the enactment of reforms to promote democratic coercion. So in the early 80s and 90s, the Colombian police was defined by a profound institutional crisis. It was engaging in rampant extrajudicial violence against predominantly poor citizens. It was responsible for the majority of human rights violations, according to the Inspector General of Colombia, even above that of the army. And it was facing a moment of profound societal division over the role of police in society. So on the one hand, we had poor and working class communities, including Afro-Colombian and indigenous communities, from Ciudad Bolívar in Bogotá to La Iguana in Medellín and to La Guajira, engaged in protests and mobilization against police violence. But on the other, we had middle class business sectors and landowners demanding a forceful response to growing urban crime. And so in this context, police were able to leverage their control over the drug war to limit intervention by civilian authorities. And so sort of in the policy space, what we saw was that very few cases of police violence were ever investigated, let alone punished. And public officials were very reticent to ever even engage in any kind of intervention in policing. They widely acknowledged that policing was in crisis, but police reform remained off the table. Even in the context of broad institutional innovations and transformations that were happening in Colombia at the time, in the early 1990s. So we have the 1991 Constitution, which created a whole host of new institutions. We have Cesar Gaviria's institutional shakeup. He came into office really wanting to shake things up and change all kinds of policies. But in this moment of transformation, the police was off the table. I document in the book how a 1992 police reform bill that was introduced in the Congress ended up being shelved due to pressure on members of Congress by the National Police. But this all changed in 1993 following the rape and murder of a little girl in a police station. We saw diverse sectors of Colombian society denouncing the police and calling for reform. We saw opposition leaders in Congress holding televised hearings to investigate the case. And almost within just weeks of the case coming to light, the president convened two commissions to propose reforms. Reforms that really sought to upend every aspect of policing and promote democratic coercion. So I won't go over every aspect of the reform in any detail, but if you think back to the kind of characteristics of democratic policing that I mentioned, this reform really sought to target everything, from recruitment of policing all the way to promotion, to the demilitarization of the rank structure, which in line with sort of what Gustavo was saying, was really a huge step. It created new civilian mechanisms for civilian external oversight, both by citizens on the ground and by a hyper powerful commissioner for the national police. So back then we saw a real, and this is very similar to the reform that was enacted in Buenos Aires province in the 1990s as well. We really saw politicians and civil society thinking big about what we need to do to change policing. But what we're seeing sort of more recently is a kind of a shrinking of the policy space when we're thinking about police reform, and this is sort of the reform gap. So the Colombian police, of course, is nothing compared to what it was in the by the early 1990s, but it is stepping into a phase of renewed crisis. We've seen in the last decade the emergence of sort of the Fellowship of the Ring, the sort of scandalous sexual abuse and corruption case. We've seen extrajudicial violence rising in recent years, including over the past year, very high-profile killings, particularly of Black Colombians, under the guise of enforcing pandemic measures, and then of course the case of Javier Ordóñez, who was also killed under the guise of enforcing pandemic measures, and which led to widespread societal protest, sort of across all of these cases. And we're also seeing sort of eroding societal trust of the national police, sort of where, for the last 2 decades, they had really enjoyed high levels of support among society. They're really reaching levels of criticism that we haven't seen in various decades, and kind of reaching a level of criticism that we haven't seen since the early 1990s. But at the same time, what I found in my recent field work, and sort of in just sort of following the recent cases, is that people are kind of continuing to find that the national police is kind of impervious to civilian accountability. So here I just cite a human rights lawyer arguing that it's harder to hold police officers accountable in court than it is military. And similarly, I cite an interview that I did with the Inspector General, an official within the Inspector General's office, specifically whose job it is to control the police, to provide oversight of the police, saying, I don't believe that it's the role of state entities to, provide oversight of the police, right? Because he argues that this would weaken it and leave it at the mercy of criminals. And that kind of in both civil society and public officials, we're seeing a kind of a resignation that you can't, of non-reform. I interviewed a member of the last reform commission that was created following the Fellowship of the Ring scandal, who sort of was like, yes, we proposed all this stuff and it hasn't been implemented, and it's probably never going to be implemented, sort of because it would probably be too much of a political wave. And more recently, in response to the recent protest cases and killings in the last year, similarly, Maria Victoria Llorente, a very prominent civil security expert in Colombia, says similarly, the conditions for reform are just not there. There's sort of too much polarization. There's sort of too much, we're just not going to see the type of big reform that we saw in the early 1990s. We're seeing a similar. How much time do I have? Am I over already? 2 minutes. Okay. Let's do a quick trip to Sao Paulo, where I'm sort of finding something quite similar. A kind of a resignation that reform just isn't going to happen, and if it does, it's not going to be anything of real substance. And so I can contrast it to the last moment in Sao Paulo, where there was really a big societal-wide questioning, reckoning about the role of policing. And this happened in 1997 when police were caught on video, and this was televised nationally and internationally, of police showing acts of violence in the low-income community of Favela Naval in the city of Diadema. And this was something that generated huge public changes in public opinion in society. For example, we see that in response to Favela Naval, the proportion of citizens in Sao Paulo who found that police were too violent go from 44% to 73%. We saw the Congress debating the outright abolition of the military police in Brazil. We saw proposals being generated to have much more strict oversight and internal disciplinary regimes within the military police. All of this in response to this kind of little earthquake in policing in Sao Paulo. But since Favela Naval, even though the policing is still just as violent, just as racialized, or just as authoritarian in the ways that I'll describe, we're seeing no such reckoning as we saw in the 1990s. So here in this chart, we see that very quickly, police killings are not only increasing in recent years, but they're occupying and this is the line, an ever increasing proportion of all homicides in the state of Sao Paulo. So as homicides have been going down, policing still constitutes between a quarter and a third, depending on the year, of all killings in the state of Sao Paulo. And that violence, as you might expect, is deeply racialized and spatially defined. So here we see that in, sort of Sao Paulo is designated between sort of center and periphery model. So we see that sort of the cases with the higher number of deaths of police killings are those that are in the urban peripheries. At the same time, we find that that the percentage of victims that are Black of these killings are quite high across the board, even in parts of the city, such as those in the center, in those central regions, where they are the minority. That we're still seeing them constituting a majority of victims. Similarly, I could sort of talk on and on and on about the sort of racialized nature of police killings, but sort of some of the things that I'll just mention is again the kind of a sort of a state acknowledgement of this arbitrary, racially defined exceptional use of force, and a kind of an acceptance by public officials of this. So 2/3 of victims of police killings in Sao Paulo are Black, even though they're just over a third of the population. And sort of as I I quote here an interview with a military police officer that I did, where he says, if you stop a white guy, if you see a white guy and a Black guy walking, the white guy could be carrying stolen merchandise, but you stop the Black guy. And this is sort of a logic that is even in formal, police documents. And this is sort of an order that was given to police officials in the city of Campinas, where it says, stop when you're conducting street stops, stop individuals that are, Black and between the ages of 18 and 25 years old. So again, this is what I'm saying, what I mean, sort of a kind of a state official acceptance of sort of arbitrary coercion. And this is similarly a quote with an interview that I did with the sort of the top official within the military police charged with internal oversight. And as I was talking to him about the increasing killings between 2014 and 2018, I'll just sort of summarize this, but he's sort of acknowledging that police are taking the law into their own hands, that they are engaging in more killing in response to a loosening of the criminal laws, of what they perceive as a loosening of the criminal laws. And so there's a kind of, again, an acceptance by public officials that police violence is both racialized and arbitrary in that way, but also happening in clear contravention of the laws. And so sort of as we've seen a clear increase in police violence that is racialized, police violence that is outside the bounds of the law, as acknowledged by police officials themselves, we're seeing types of reform. The conversation about reform is far narrower than that what I described from a couple of decades back. So this is just one example of last year when police killings started to make headlines once again. The governor said police are going to be, we're going to do some retraining of the stuff that police already learned, and police are going to get video, body cameras. And that was sort of the extent of the conversation among sort of policy sectors and public officials around police reform. The sort of big questions of policing are not really being asked, and the kind of reckoning that happened before isn't really going on. And so the question that I'm thinking about now is sort of like, are democracies sort of still capable of bringing about the conditions that make police reform more likely, that I talk about in my book? And will this failure to reform lead defund and abolitionist movements to expand in Latin America? This is sort of what I'm seeing among the sort of activist groups in Sao Paulo that I work with, is that they're sort of like those in the US are saying what we need to do is just defund the police, invest in communities, and abolish the police altogether. And so anyway, just something for us to sort of think about as we sort of, again, central questions of democracy in this conversation about policing, police violence, and race. So I'll stop there, and thanks I know I went over those 2 minutes. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Let me figure out how to stop sharing.
I think down at the bottom of your screen. There you go.
Got it. Yeah.
Thank you so much. That was a powerful presentation. Thank you. Vesla, would you like to take the mic here?
Yes, thank you. And my head is just spinning from those excellent presentations. So I hope to be able to add, let me share my screen. Thank you for bringing us together in this way, as Ginyonda knows, and through many conversations. You know, I have been very frustrated in working in my own field of American or subfield of American politics that we simply do not have the concepts to understand what Yanilda calls authoritarian policing, what I'm going to call racial authoritarian governance within our context. And so oftentimes the discussion around police violence gets narrowed and collapsed in these very, as Lucia said, technocratic ways. And so pointing to the comparative work that's being done has allowed me to broaden my framing and to finally have concepts to lean on that can get us out of this, you know, narrow, let's study police bias and let's study disparities, and to begin to think about authoritarian policing as what the American state is and does to Black communities, right? And once you open that up, right, and you're able to stretch across time, which is what I'm going to do today, hopefully, the conversation is no longer, you know, what body camera reforms can we have, and more, how ought we reinscribe democracy into policing practices? Is that possible, as Yunilda nicely said? Okay, so let me begin. To be Black in America is to live, and maybe I should say to be Black in the Americas, is to live under an authoritarian state. There is no racial authoritarianism without police. There is no Jim Crow without police. There is no Northern segregation without police. And there is no Black resistance and collective resistance tradition without police. Yet somehow, my field, some of our fields, have mischaracterized this relationship across time and space. Police have been central to the construction and maintenance of racial authoritarianism and of Black citizenship. But many of our fields have treated them as a sideshow to power, to state authority, to the state's relationship to its citizens, and tiptoed around concepts that regularly show up in studies of other countries. So my co-authors and I should say my doctoral student, Gwen Prowse at Yale, we constructed the largest known archive, we think, of narratives about how policing actually operates, not its formal embodiments, but how it actually operates, that we think exists by people who are so policed. And what we wanted to do was build a bottom-up archive, a bottom-up knowledge of the state, a theory of the state from below. And to do so, and I'm going to introduce you to that archive, it's called the Portals Policing Archive, and I'm going to show you a brief clip that's going to show you how the portals operated, because they're quite a distinct methodology within social science. To do so, we're also going to trace the ways that state coercion and policing have played a perpetual, albeit evolving role in the Black experience of citizenship. We're drawing from a number of sources from the Black counterpublic collected throughout the 20th century and 21st century, connecting and reading these policing narratives today through a long subaltern canon dating back to the first Reconstruction. Some of these are here. You'll see the first prison memoir by a Black man in 1858, Austin Reed, born free, but summarily taken to the House of Refuge at age 6, after he was basically an indentured servant. and burns down the farm he's working on, to the narratives of ex-slaves collected in the Federal Writers Project during the Great Depression, to the Kerner Commission field team interviews, to the oral histories collected of Black Americans who lived through Jim Crow in the 1930s and 40s, and I'll draw on some of those today, to the oral history collections that were collected in and after several rebellions towards police power and authority. So Detroit, 1967, Watts, Newark, Milwaukee, Baltimore, 1968, Crown Heights, to the Mississippi Black Paper, a very little known archival source that is basically affidavits collected of civil rights workers who endured police brutality in the 50s and 60s, as well as memoirs, Black historical newspapers, newsletters, interviews with activists, to the writings of Black people in the American Prison Writing Archive of the 21st century. We're putting together this cumulated set of sources that were not part of one oral history collection. In fact, many of them aren't known, many of them have never been plumbed before, but that together we think finally can represent the substantial range of Black counterpublic critiques of American democracy via interactions with the state's second face, interactions with police, predation, jails, halfway houses, and on and on. Together, and I get this question often, well, aren't these just, sort of stories, right? Aren't these, how can we quantify these? Aren't they just sort of random stories of people that are disaffected? How much external validity do they have? And I would say that together, these represent easily hundreds of thousands of pages of oral testimony. So when people say, aren't these just stories, we now have an incredible first-person witness archive across generations, across decades, across places across different city regime types. And by doing this, we can illustrate how race-class subjugated people have always done the work of exposing US democracy's contradictions and have always posed some of the most incisive prescriptions for repair and reconciliation. In the book that we're writing, The State from Below, we are seeking to provide what we think is an important concept, racial authoritarianism. And we're seeking to do so by turning to this primary evidence base. Because when we turn to their theorization, when we turn to their political vocabularies, their critiques and rebuttals, by listening to their subjugated theory of the state, we can arrive at uncommon insights about our democracy itself and a new vision of what is possible. They understand democracy as it actually occurs in their lives better than those who set out to study its official structures and rules. They understand its limits. They are central witnesses to its uneasy relationship to control. And yet, the state violence and structural violence described in these pages in so many oral history accounts were paired with epistemic violence, a discounting regularly again and again and again of their grassroots knowledge of what the state is and does by mainstream academics, by policymakers who wrote and theorized and designed policy from the perspective of those for whom domination was not a core concern. Once we turn to these accounts, we see that the bedrocks, the hallmarks of democracy itself, equality, rule of law, freedom to speak and assemble and be left alone, bore such little resemblance to what was being described in Portal's narratives that we needed to actually re-theorize the state. We go directly to the sources and sites of police occupation and terror, which is necessary to build an understanding of racial oppression in the afterlives of slavery and Jim Crow. Okay, so let me, and I would say, and Yunilda brought this up as well, that once we do that, we can see that repression is occurring and was even extended through democratic justifications, okay? It coexists quite easily with democracy. And once we did this mapping, we were struck by how often and how enduring and consistent the experience of racial authoritarianism and racialized policing has been. They use the same terms, right? They chart some of the very same experiences. Okay, so let me, actually, Eduardo, how much time do I have? Because I may skip my little video.
By my clock, you have about 7 minutes left.
Okay, what do we think? Do you want to see my video of how the portals work, or should we?
I think so.
Okay, so, you know, today, these are the questions that are spinning in my head. How has authoritarian policing played this perpetual role in the experience of citizenship across time and place? I'm going to be able to speak a bit, you know, to the former, but the latter is what I'm hoping we can generate today, right? Once we see this, and when Yunilda and Lucia were talking about sexual violence, about youth, my, you know, little light bulbs were going off, because the exact same kinds of things can be found in these pages. How do we study repressive and coercive institutions within nominally democratic regimes? How do we study collective efforts to secure Black and Brown liberation? And then I'm going to show you this bit about the Portals Policing Project, where we built this kind of collective civic infrastructure, both to collect narratives of policing, but also to build power and amplify connections across the United States. And we have one portal in Mexico City. Okay, so here we go.
There's a lot of police brutality out here. There's a lot of racial profiling, and it's the top of the discussion everywhere I go.
We promised ourselves as young Black folks in Ferguson, everything we see, feel, breathe here, I'm taking it home.
So we're starting a global community with the world, putting people differences aside. This is our way of killing stereotypes. This is also our way of giving people the truth about culture.
Daniel Harris, Pickett, Amir Rice, Antoine Schubert, Alton Sterling, Orlando Castile. Verily, verily, the Spirit says to me, don't look away.
Okay, so you saw a little bit about how we collected narratives about policing. And it wasn't just about collecting narratives, it was also about building a place where people could storytell, where people could build resistances across communities enduring the same police violence and state violence. So what did we learn? And what do we learn when we connect these 850 conversations that took place in the portal with some of the oral histories spanning different regimes across the United States, okay? From post-Reconstruction through Jim Crow on forward. I want to talk about one that comes up very often, and this is the experience of policing in childhood. So John David Cooper and Alan Hunt and Barbara Cooper, his wife, were describing life growing up in the 1930s and 40s in Memphis, and this is what they said. They run us away from over there. That's when we found out what race really was then. On weekends, we would go to Washington Park, and that was a colored park, as they used to call them. And the young white fellows who went to L.C. Humes High School, which is right down the street from Manassas, would come over to that park and we'd play sandlot football against them until the police came by and saw it and broke it up. They'd come in there, they'd run the white kids out the park and run us back on up toward the pool. Just didn't allow no mixing, you know. Sometimes we'd be ahead when the police come and break it up. Sometimes they'd be ahead. So we'd always have to come back to do it again, you know, until Mama got wind of it, that the police was breaking the games up and running the black youngsters with sticks. They would just talk to the white ones, but they'd try to hit you with a stick to get you away from there. So after she found out, she says, I don't want you going back over there and playing no more ball with them white boys. And basically then his friend keeps on and says, well, coming on up from that, when I was a little older and we get out on the street, the police run us off the corner if we were standing up just talking, you know. They drive up and say, nigger, get off that corner, you know, or boy. Both of them was about the same. And they called old folks uncle and stuff like that. But that meant for you, you had to go if they tell you to move. And so we just got used to moving when they said to move, until I got about 15 or 16. And then I didn't want to move so quick. I was in high school, just getting in high school pretty good. And sometimes they come run us off the corner and they'd go one block and turn around. Don't be on that corner when we get back. So we'd leave the corner and go around and get behind some hedges. And when they'd come back, we'd brick them. We'd throw bricks at them, bust the windows out and take off. But that was our way of retaliating, you know. So in this conversation, you can see clearly how early encounters with policing are building their conception of what it means to be Black, building their conception of race, telling them where they can be, enforcing segregation, enforcing where they ought to go. And then you can also see that they decided to retaliate, right? That their criminality was actually in response to a consistent pattern of police demarcating where they could go and how they could congregate. The second one is between somebody who grows up in Fort Worth, Texas, named Ferdy Walker. At that time, I was 11 years old, and I will never forget it. I used to go back and forth to church on Sunday afternoons to the United Methodist Youth Group, and I always rode the bus. And you had to stand on the corner, which was about 2 blocks from my house, to catch the bus. And the policemen in those days, all police people were white, and all bus drivers were white. Her husband says all city employees were white. Yeah, all city employees. And these policemen would harass me as I was standing on this corner waiting for the bus to come. And sometimes the 2 of them would drive up. You know, the bus stop was up high and the street was down low. And they'd drive up under there and they'd expose themselves. And the interviewer says, who, the policeman? Yes, while I was standing there. And it just really scared me to death. And the only reason I did not go home at that time was because if I had gone home, my mother would have made me stay. So I just stepped back from the corner. But it was these same cops. So I had a morbid fear of policemen all of my life, and it has not completely gone away. But, and this was in the broad open daylight with the sun shining, but I will never forget it. And it has always come back to me every time I get into a really tight experience. That was really bad, and it was bad for all Black girls, you know. And her husband says, that's one of the things that parents passed on to their children, fear and hate of the police. If you look at the Black kids today, even the little ones, they are scared to death of policemen, and it's beginning to let up a little bit. The police are trying to erase that, but it's generations and generations and generations of fear. And Ferdy Walker goes on to describe how she becomes a social worker later in her life and would never call the police when a child was being abused. She would turn to communal sources of support. She would turn to ministers and civic leaders and neighbors and others in her community. Now, I'm going to forward to some of the recollections, and they're very common. They're probably one of the most common articulations within the Portals narrative archive, is this understanding that police aren't there to, ensure safety, but they're there to enforce codes of Black behavior. So this is in the Portals archives today. What I just showed you was from the oral histories of people who lived through Jim Crow. The first time the police stopped me, I was 11 years old, and they stopped me because I was playing water balloon fights with my friends during the summer. And they handcuffed all of us. They paraded us in front of the community. They had the helicopter on. And this was like a group of 11-year-olds, like nobody was older than 13. And like they had guns on us, like they pointed a gun to my head and they threatened our lives. Afterwards, even though we were kids, like the entire communities thought that we were up to something bad. Another person says, once you in a crowd, 4 to 5 people, y'all just walking, they're gonna roll the window down, ask y'all a question, probably pat you down. They wanna do all that just by walking down the street, coming home from school, still got book bags on. They'll just get out the car and bug up with you. They'll just start spazzing out of nowhere and then want us to say something, want us to say, go at them with lip so they could have a reason to grab that gun. I ain't even fitting to lie to you. That's how it worked. You all can read the others to yourselves, but basically one of the most consistent experiences is an early understanding of how state power works, and very early in 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, seeing police as one of the first representatives of the state, and the ways that they learned how they needed to move, what neighborhoods they couldn't go into, what hairstyles they couldn't wear, what kinds of times they couldn't be out on the street, not congregating in groups. A very consistent, I would say, almost informal constitution that they were living by, or informal municipal code. And of course, quantitatively, we can see, and this, it amazes me how often I talk to police reformers or to academics who have studied policing for a long time, and they don't understand that the age of onset in policed communities is often under the age of 14. And for Black kids, it's the median age is 10. We can also see this in aggregate data, in administrative data in cities like New York that have tracked this and basically found that there is more police stops of kids than there are of other age groups. In fact, more use of force was directed towards Black kids than all age categories of whites combined, okay? This is a policy of childhood. Policing is an early kind of lesson to kids about how the state operates, how government works, right? And they're getting this lesson before they're getting a driver's license, before they're paying taxes, before they're signing up for Medicaid and Medicare, before they're going to college, right? Other kinds of, before they're entering the military, right? And so we ought to conceive of it as a singular site of civic education, and one that is educating them into subjectivity and not into the habits of democratic citizens. Of course, I have shown in other work that people who have encounters with police do come to understand government differently, do come to understand their own place within democracy differently, right? Do come to have less efficacy. And you know what, I think I'm gonna run through these very, very quickly because I'm probably heading out of time. But one of the very interesting things that we were mapping both in the historical oral histories and in the portals is this construction of a what Tracy Mears and Ben Justice call the hidden curriculum, what we have called too much knowledge, too little power. That there's that broadly across these oral histories and in the portals archive, people say we don't have the police, we don't have constitutional citizenship here. We have to live by a different set of rules, right? So you'll see I've bolded in red. Maybe that's your reality, but for us, we have to operate differently, right? And actually, let's read this second one because this person was talking to an interlocutor in Mexico City. And he was sort of trying to describe how government works in the United States. Well, I think that most real people will understand the United States Constitution realizes that the Constitution protects the people from the government. It says what the government cannot do to you, okay? And what you can expect the government to leave you alone and not do certain things to you. They can't take your land away from you. They can't come into your house, your home. They can't do certain things. But when you tell the police that I have a right not to answer because the Constitution says so, they don't care. That doesn't matter to them. They need that information. And if you don't give it to them, they're going to make your life miserable. And so you can see here, again and again and again, almost like it was the official rule book. People would say, we cannot congregate in groups. You're walking with 3 or 4 Black people, you're gonna get stopped, right? You can't even ride in your car 4 deep if you're Black. Jury of your peers, we don't have that, right? Constitution gives you so many rights. Let me tell you, we don't have privacy. They're just gonna stop and frisk you for no reason. You try and walk in the house, they pull in that motherfucker behind you. They don't give no fuck, that's their job. Their job is to lock your ass up and they're not gonna stop. You gotta govern yourself, okay? And when you look back through oral histories in time, what do people say? Black women say again and again and again and again, we couldn't wear shorts and walk through the city center. They would arrest you for wearing shorts. We couldn't go through this park that was bordering our neighborhood because you'd get arrested. We couldn't speak to them in certain ways. We couldn't be on the corner congregating. If they came to your house, there was no search warrant. They would bust down the door and they were coming in, okay? Black police officers in these oral histories, Black soldiers describe the experience of racially authoritarian policing, okay? And I think I'm just gonna skip through these and end up, and even the experience of state violence is incredibly continuous across time. So one of the central themes is how police would terrorize and abuse you, but they would seek to do it without leaving a mark. So this first one is from Baltimore in the early 2000s. He's describing the early 2000s, but he's giving the account today. I remember being a little boy. We did mischievous stuff as little kids, going to 5 and dime stores and stealing little water guns. But when we got caught, they took us down to the police station. You know what they did? They put the big phone books on our heads and hit us with the blackjack, the knife sticks they used to carry. You have so much ringing in your ear, man. You're like, man, I'm not going to forget this. Newton, Georgia, describing life under racially authoritarian policing in Jim Crow. When Black people men particularly, would go down there, they were taken in the back and poured water on them and also beat them with a rubber hose. Now, a rubber hose don't show bruises like a beating with a stick or something. I know 2 or 3 young men today who went off their rocker by him beating on them, and they never did recover from it. They still walk around talking to themselves all day long. And then finally, one of the questions I think I'd like to ask moving forward is how ought we understand both the quotidian resistances, the small individual resistances, and the more collective resistances taking shape across countries and across time. The portal's narratives are pushing us towards a different understanding of individual and collective political responses. How do people argue for and against particular courses of political action in response to community criminalization and police repression? What strategies are used to navigate the described gap between the knowledge of their state and how it works and the intimate presence of authorities in their lives? How do they exercise agency? Particularly in the Jim Crow narratives, right? This is very, very important because this is a time when people didn't have the right to vote, where police intimidation of seeking out the ballot box was very, very high. They didn't have the constitutional right to move about freely. What are the alternative visions of power and safety that we see when we begin to look to oral histories? How do they understand and seek to build Black and Brown liberation across country contexts? So the first, this is a person in Behind the Veil, the Jim Crow narrative, speaking of his uncles being tired of taking abuse and their resistance, and how that resistance gets criminalized as drunkenness. They just simply wouldn't accept it anymore. They decided, I will not walk out in the street for you. I will not accept you hitting me without hitting you back. If you're going to kill me, you're just going to have to kill me because I'm tired. I'm very tired and I'm not going to do it anymore. I'm not going to accept it anymore. And they voiced it. And oftentimes this officer, his name was Mr. Greer, was the sheriff then. And he would arrest them and he would put it on drunkenness because we weren't supposed to, because you weren't supposed to have you drunk. You do these things and speak up for yourself. It didn't occur to them that you were not drunk. You were just tired. And then this one, and there's so many, I can hardly, show them here, but this one really stuck out to me. Why? Because it's the existence of an underground railroad happening after slavery into the 1930s to help people escape from prison plantations. During the period of time when there was such cruelty in the lower South, when they uncovered the peon areas, those plantations down there, where they had Blacks that were in prison on the plantations, right? Convict leasing. Many Blacks escaped from those. See what they would do, and he's pretending he's the person, he's not actually the person. I'm a farmer. I'd purchase the persons who were jailed, Black. I'd purchase their time, and they would have to come out and work for me for a certain number of years, work that time out. And many of them never got out of those plantations. When they'd try to leave, they'd kill them and bury them. When the investigation began to open up and these things were found, many of those people escaped. Many times we have slept what we might call escapees from those camps in our funeral home on their way to different places. And those were things that very few Blacks knew about because we couldn't even trust Blacks. We had a lot of Uncle Toms, We couldn't even trust Blacks to let us know what we were doing. And then this is coming forward to today. I believe this is in the Milwaukee Portal's narratives. The whole idea around the hood claimers, like us policing our own neighborhoods, us interacting with each other and knowing who we need to call to take care of knuckleheads, right? Knowing what needs to be done when something goes wrong and you need to contact in order to correct it, right? Having parent advocates, having student advocates in the school, just people to insulate us so that we ain't got to worry about no outsider coming into our community and monitoring us and managing us. We don't need no management. We govern ourselves. I would just end with the question, at what point do we need to re-theorize American democracy in light of consistent, enduring, decades-long police repression of Black communities, Black and Brown communities? When they say across city regimes, across generation, across decades, that they can't claim the guardrails of American democracy, why do we continue to see these utterances as exceptional, as not constitutive of what our government actually does? And I'm pleased to have this conversation because I do think starting to trace these not just across time, but across different country contexts is the way to move forward. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Vesla. Thank you, everyone, for wonderful presentations. I know we are out of time, unfortunately, but we have been answering questions. The panelists have been answering some of the questions directly through the Q&A. So thank you for doing that, everyone. And I think a good point to end is to kind of build off of Vesla's question about re-theorizing American democracy. I think one even to take it a little bit further is to think about all of you have highlighted sort of the limitations and challenges that democracy poses for security in its broadest sense, and for reforming some of the core state institutions to which people are exposed to, as Vesla said, at such an early age. And so I think one of the questions that we need to think about as we move forward in this agenda is re-theorizing democracy as a conversation across borders, and not one that's particular to one country or the other, but instead to think about regional sort of dynamics here and how we might do that in a very fruitful way to move forward the conversation. So I want to thank everyone here today for your presentations, for your engagement, for the wonderful presentations. Thank all of the audience members as well for your questions. If you didn't get your question asked, I'm sorry, but please try to email folks as well to see if you can get some information there as well. But thank you very much, and I appreciate your time. Take care, everyone.